Welcome to My Journey So Far. In this podcast, I interview people to see what life experiences they have had to shape them to be the person they are today. My next guest is Claire McAuliffe. She is the author of Lessons from a Cult Survivor. She has been a speaker on TED Talks 4 times. She is a religious anthropologist, along with being a mother of 8. Please tune in as Claire describes her journey in life so far.
My name is Claire McAuliffe. I come from Brisbane, Australia, and I spent my life in 2 different fundamental Catholic sects. So the first one was very traditional. So it was very traditional Catholic, and it was very, very restricted in the way I was brought up. I grew up on a country farm, and my siblings and I were homeschooled. We didn't have a TV. We had very little social interaction with other people. And so that caused us to be like socially inept and naive in many instances. And then I married quite young. I was 18 and a half when I married a man that was 13 years older than me. He was known to the family, but it was only when I was about 40, like after I'd divorced him, that I discovered I'd been groomed by him. So, that opened up another sort of Pandora's box that, and that's how I feel when it comes to the journeys by these people, is that the healing is never really done. And as you reach different times of your life, there are various layers that come off. So in a nutshell, that's kind of like the first sect that I grew up in. And then that first husband, he then decided, like, he had a great interest in end of world prophecies, and he was very interested also in Marian apparitions, so apparitions of Our Lady. And he found a supposed seer who had quite a big following here in Australia and overseas, but the main areas were here in Australia. And he wanted to move there. So we were living in Melbourne, in Victoria at the time, and then this seer lived on the south coast of New South Wales, so 2 hours south of Sydney. And he wanted to, so Tony, my first husband, wanted to move there. And so we moved there, and we were living on a restored caravan park that was like a community. So there were 180 people living there at the time. So, and I spent 9.5 years there before I challenged the leader in a series of letters on doctrinal issues. And then we were evicted. So that's a nutshell. There you go.
So when you were growing up, how many siblings did you have?
I am the eldest of 9.
Okay. And what did your home life look like?
I lived on a small hobby farm of 20 acres, and like the household was busy in terms of, like, we had cows, goats, sheep, chickens, pigs, a dog, and we all helped with, the upkeep of that, milking the cows and goats and feeding the animals, all of the things. But we were homeschooled, and there was great prevalence put on religious education, so Catholic religious education, and it was very strict, especially for girls. So it was very gendered. So it was gendered and binary. So it was only male, female. There's no gay, any other. So I don't want anybody to be offended when I do speak about just male, female, because that's how I grew up. That's not how I think. That's not how I think and believe now. But just to put things in context, because sometimes, like, the world has moved on and opened up. Yes. But for me, I was brought up very binary, male, female, and either, you become, for men, they become priests or brothers, or they get married. And for women, they're either married or become nuns. So those were really the choices. Mum taught us the tenets of the Catholic religion, like traditional Catholicism. So there was a great deal of weight placed on like how we dressed. You know, we had certain modesty and behavioural requirements placed on us as females, and that started from when we were very young. You know, you always had to be modest, you had to be quiet, submissive, and you know, you never wore jeans or shorts or pants of any description, no form-fitting clothes, because we are basically temptresses and we need to ensure that we don't tempt men in any way. And, you know, even when, you know, keep your hair long. When you go to church, cover your head. I was thinking about it the other day because I'm writing an essay for my university course. And on the one hand, we were supposed to be attractive enough and ladylike enough to attract the right man, but then you've got to make sure that you're covered to a certain degree, so then you're not tempting them, you know. So for instance, like a girl was always encouraged to have as long hair as possible, you know, because her hair is her crowning glory. But then, you know, you can't show that off too much, because then that's tempting to men. Like, you know what I mean? There was that juxtaposition. Again, as I get older, as I do more university study, as I read into this, you know, there's that real balancing act of like, let's, you know, through the modesty and behavioral requirements, you know, it kills off a woman's natural creativity, identity, her sexuality, and it stifles her because she's funneled into this ideal where it's got to be very much like imitating the Blessed Virgin Mary, you know, being quiet, demure, eyes cast down, speak quietly, don't laugh too much. You know, it's really putting a lid on women in any way, in every way, shape, and form. See, in order to be part of a community, you know, there are certain things that you have to adhere to, you know, in order to stay a part of that community. And it's important that we have community around us, whether it's friends or church or social. And so for many people, religion does fulfill a lot of those tenets for people, you know, a lot of those needs. So like religion isn't inherently wrong. It's just the way individuals interpret it. So there are certain requirements in these traditional groups for, you know, where the weight of the morals really fall to the women. Instead of, you know, men also taking responsibility for their own thoughts, words, and actions. And it's all very much a patriarchal, hierarchical system, you know. So it's quite complex, you know, in many ways, you know.
So you're homeschooled growing up on a farm. Did you go to church often with the group?
Yes, every Sunday we travelled 2 hours one way to go to attend church, to attend mass that was said in Latin. So, and all my brothers were altar boys, so that was, you know, there was emphasis placed on that. So, you know, we were very much religious in that regard. You know, we would say prayers 3 times a day and grace before meals. Statues in the house, all that sort of thing. Wearing, well, the Catholic scapula around our necks. We had the Catholic scapula, but then there was all these other little medals and things as well that we had to wear.
So did your parents grow up going to the same church, or what
No.
was their upbringing like?
Uh, well, my parents were quote unquote normal Catholics. So just for a bit of context and history, there was the Second Vatican Council that was held in Rome between 1962 to 1965. And John the 23rd opened up that council with the intention of throwing open the doors of the church and sort of allowing a breath of fresh air and some updates. And not everybody was happy with those updates. They felt that the updates went too far. They created too much modernism and newness in the church. And there were some clerics that did not like that. And there was one in particular, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who was a French archbishop. And he, in the early 1970s, he opened up his own traditional seminary in Aachen in Switzerland. And he began training priests or young men as seminarians and ultimately priests in the traditional mass, so in the traditional way. So they would be taught to say mass in Latin, and it was all pre 1962. So they did not accept the changes in the church. And so there was a wave of traditionalism that it happened in every country, but I'll speak specifically from the Australian context. So there was a wave of traditionalism that came across Australia in the early to mid 1970s. So my parents were brought up in the traditional church before the changes, and then obviously the changes crept through, so they were aware of those and they were still attending mass. My mother was she was training to be a nurse in a nursing order, the St. John of God order in Subiaco in Western Australia. So she was a nun for a few years before she left the convent, and then met my father and then got married. And when they were married in those early years of their married life, they did just attend the local church. But then in 1974, 75, they met a priest who did not accept the changes in the Catholic Church, and he began saying the Latin Mass privately in people's homes. And my parents' home was one of them. And then my mum really loved the Tridentine Mass, and it really made her feel quite because for a lot of these people, they felt left out, and they didn't manage the changes in the church very well. So of course, when they were offered the Tridentine Mass, it was going back to something comforting and familiar. So rather than embrace the change and learn about the change, there were a significant number that just really pushed back on that, and they felt the familiarity and comfort of the Tridentine Mass, and so they rather be in that than move forward. So that's the context of that. Yes.
And how big was that group?
Well, it started small in the 1970s and then the 1980s, and then in the early 1980s. So the old priest that started it here in Australia, he was already elderly. He was already gosh, he seemed really old because I was only a little girl, but he would have been in his mid to late 60s, and then he began saying mass in private houses, and then there was a church in Melbourne that was bought, but he would go to 3 or 4 states here in Australia and across to New Zealand and also Tasmania, saying mass and gathering little pockets of traditional Catholics. And then in the early 1980s, Archbishop Lefebvre sent a priest, his first priest, or first priests. There were 2. There was one in Sydney and one in Melbourne, and that's where it really grew. So that it's called the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX for short, and you or anybody else listening can just Google SSPX and you will see that they'll just pop up everywhere. Like they're all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're not massive numbers, but they're a small but very loud group in terms of like traditionalism. So, yes. And for me, I'm going to be like, this is my area of study. So I'm moving on to be doing sociological and anthropological study into the rise of traditionalism here in Australia, because it's an area that is sorely lacking in research and history. So I'm taking that on as part of my research.
Is your sibling still a part of the group?
Yes, there's one of my sisters is still part of the group. One of my brothers has gone into another subculture, sort of a subgroup called the Sedevacantists. So they are another group that's sort of next level Catholic, but they are not in communion with the church.
Okay. So when you're growing up, when did you start thinking like maybe there's a different way?
Well, the thing was that I was a part of the Tridentine group from the time I was like 4.5 to 5, till I was about 20. And then for a couple of years, my then husband and I did attend the local church. But then my husband, like, because he had this ongoing interest in prophecy, he discovered this supposed seer of Marian apparitions in Nowra in New South Wales. Now, those Marian apparitions, there ended up being 2 Catholic Church inquiries into the validity of those supposed messages from heaven, and they were deemed not true. But at the time he was creating little communities, because the idea was that the world was going to end in the year 2000. And so the only people that would be saved would be the ones living on these community properties. So there was one in South Australia. There was, I think there was 3 in Victoria. The main one was in Nowra in New South Wales. There was one in New Zealand, one in America, a couple in Canada, and a couple in Germany, I believe, and maybe a small, like, beginnings of one in Ireland. But now this group, they kind of cherry picked parts of Catholicism that they liked. So they were still Catholic based, but they eventually weren't part of the church, because they refused to adhere to what the instructions of the local bishop. So Tony wanted to move there, and so we moved there in 1997. And I did not want to move there at all. But I thought, having been brought up to be submissive and, you obey your husband. So I thought that if I sacrificed what I wanted for a few years, well, then he would, eventually see the futility of it all and then move on. But as time wore on, I could see that he, did not want to move on, and he wanted to be part of the group. And I did not. I saw a better future for my children. I wanted my children to be, to go to school, they were going to the little school that was on the community property, but it was obviously had a very, very religious slant. But I wanted all of my children, but especially my girls, to be free, to be independent, to have full creativity, like to wear what they want, to be really, to find their own identity and do whatever they wanted in life, and not be restricted like I had been restricted. So, I started to see that Tony did not want to change. He wanted to he wanted to stay here, because that, again, this was his comfort zone. Like, I can verbalize all this now and see the patterns because of my study and lots of reading. But Tony was very much like my mother in terms of, like, he liked the stability of the Tridentine Mass. He liked that familiarity and comforting part of being in a community that all thought the same, dressed the same, did the same. But for me, ultimately, it was not the life that I wanted to live. And so I challenged the leader on doctrinal issues because he was ordaining and consecrating married men as bishops and priests. Now, in the Catholic Church, you have the Eastern Rite and the Western Rite, and we are the Western Rite. So mainly most of America and Europe and Australia, UK, like they're mainly Western. But when you have like the Orthodox Catholics, like the Russian Orthodox, Ukraine Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, they have married priests in some of those. But what this leader was trying to do, he was trying to bring East and West together, and that's never been the view of the Catholic Church at all. And so I was questioning that because, in my view, a lot of these married men, well, all of them, had no formal training whatsoever. It was basically like, I now ordain you a priest, I now consecrate you a bishop. And they weren't being shepherds of the flock in true Catholic form. And like, especially when my husband decided that he wanted to be a married priest, and like, I could see that he was not, he was basically being psychologically abusive to myself and my children. And yet, on the other hand, he was going to be like giving spiritual advice to people. Like, no.
Yeah.
Like, and that, and like, I could see all of these men being like that. They were in no way, shape, or form spiritually mature enough or educated enough to be able to do that. So that's why I challenged him. And then, of course, that's usually the number one thing that you don't do, is challenge a leader of a fundamental sect, because it never goes down well. So we got evicted. So yeah.
You must have felt very strongly about it, though.
Oh, I did. And at that time too, like, I wish I had kept those books, and I wish I'd kept all of my ramblings from that point in time, but I didn't. Like, at that time, Tony had all the books, all the Catholic books, so I knew where to go for my information. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Code of Canon Law. So he had these books on hand, so I just went looking for them because, see, at that time I was very Catholic thinking too, and I was brought up like, if the Catholic Church has rules and regulations and laws, these are what you follow because it's the right thing to do. Whilst I choose not to practice now, I do love like the aesthetics, the music, the architecture of Catholicism. I spent almost 8 months overseas, like late last year and this year, as an exchange student. I spent 6 months in the Netherlands, and I took the opportunity to travel and go into every church, Catholic or not, and but especially the Catholics. I have to say they do get it right when it comes to like the art, the architecture, the music. Pretty amazing. And yeah, I just choose not to practice as rigidly as what I was brought up to do. So, like somebody said to me, they said, you're Catholic, you're half Catholic, half Protestant, because you don't, because you love the nice part. You love the nice part of Catholicism, but you don't want to be told what to do. And I said, yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, definitely. So when you were 18, getting ready to marry Tony, was that of your choice?
he came to live with my family. So we were homeschooled, and then like we were living half an hour out of the local town. So you know, he was really the first adult outside of my family that I had interacted with. And like again, I at the time I thought it was love, but now, like later, I saw it as just being an attachment. It was an attachment. It was basically an attachment because I had no identity, I had no direction, and I was afraid, and also didn't know how to go about learning about myself, discovering myself. So, you know, I wasn't given the tools by my parents to be able to do that. And also being brought up very strict Catholic, like the only two choices really were to get married or be a nun. And then, you know, whilst in between waiting for marriage, you could be a teacher or a nurse. But then at that time in the middle 80s here in Australia, there was also there was like nurses were beginning to be taught in university. And then my mother was not a fan of university. She was like, you know, universities are where you're tempted to sin, and there's too much questioning and you'll lose your faith. And see, I was scared of losing my faith because that was the only thing I knew. You know what I mean? I didn't know that I could actually be curious. And, you know, so obviously when I was like 36 and got evicted from the second group, the community, that's when I started to become really curious. And then obviously when I started university in 2021, that's like really pushed the boundaries, you know? So, so when I was 18 and a half, I just didn't have an identity. You know, I attached my identity to Tony. And I honestly thought that he was open and all of those things, but I found that he was very closed off, very rigid. And later, after we were divorced and I found out that I'd been groomed, it all made sense. You know, he was looking for someone young to be able to mold them to the way he wanted. So, because I mean, he used to say, you know, that I talked too much, I would laugh too loud, I wasn't ladylike enough. And so I tried to mold myself to being that person, that, you know, because I thought that that was the way you were to be loved if you changed yourself. But, you know, we all know now that's, you know, that's not the way to be. And so it did not serve me well. But it took me a long time to realize that. And so, you know, I've just been becoming more of myself as I've moved along, you know, as I've become more curious, as I learn more, you know, I grow, change, and evolve. So, yes, absolutely.
I'm curious to know, what was Tony's reaction when you spoke up and got evicted from the community?
Not happy. Because, well, initially he said, well, you know, I mean, really, he had no guts and had no balls, really, but because he was saying, well, he said to me, oh, you can write these letters, but don't sign my name on there because we might get evicted. And then, you know, like it just, because he didn't think that we would get evicted if only I did it. But I mean, quite frankly, I didn't give a damn because I'd reached a point where I was done, and I no longer believed in everything that they were teaching. I was already being seen as like a renegade and a problem. And so basically, you know, like once we got evicted, like Tony was not happy, you know, but I mean, it was too late. The horse had already bolted. So I was going ahead and leading the family anyway. And he just retreated more into his shell. And I mean, the marriage was over. It had been long over. And like I wanted to I wanted to be able to bring up the children, have the freedom to bring up the children the way I wanted, to give them the best opportunities in life, to be free, to be independent, to find their own identity, to be creative. And so that's what I did.
And how many children do you have?
I have 8.
Okay. And what was the age range? Like, in what time frame did you have the 8?
14 years and 2 months, to be exact.
Okay. That's a busy household.
Very. Yeah,
No.
it was very busy. And then when I left, when we got evicted from that fundamentalist group, the eldest was 16 and the youngest was 2.
Okay. And what were you doing for work?
At the time, because I still had some kids at home, I was on welfare. And then when my youngest went to school, I got myself a job as a cleaner in a motel. So I started off with that, and then I gathered some private clients, and I actually had my own private domestic cleaning business for, I would have had it for 15, 16 years over 2 states. So when I was living in New South Wales, I did it there. And then when I moved to Queensland, I did it here as well. And that was that, like I am good at what I do. I don't do it now because I left for overseas for my exchange semester in December of 2023. So I closed my business and I went overseas, did my exchange semester. I came back in July 2024, and I've just been studying full time to finish my undergraduate degree, and that will be finished at the end of November, and then I will move on to further study next year as well.
When you were in the community, who was your main support system?
Myself, because I realized that I couldn't have friends there because there's too much backstabbing. And so I couldn't have any close friends there because, as is the nature of, 180 people living on one property, and that, it was very much a hierarchical system. And, it was religious because when we moved there, he was attempting to create another religious order where it incorporated married people and single people as religious as well. So we were forced to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience for whatever our state in life was. So as a married couple, poverty meant that you just live in whatever you're given on the property to live in, and you live on the least amount of money per week. You don't have anything pretty, like everything. It was a very much a scarcity poverty mindset, but it was glorified into being, what you give up here on earth, you gain in heaven. And then obedience was obedience to the superiors. So you have to do as you're told. It was a tad more free, being married, because obviously, you've got your responsibilities, your family responsibilities, but still, like, we still had to ask permission to go out to do shopping, like you're going out on this day at this time and you'll be back by this time. You couldn't go for holidays because the end of the world might happen while you're on holidays, and then you're not saved because you're not in community. And then the chastity part of it was basically you only have sex to have children. So there was that. So it was quite restrictive in that regard. So yeah, I tended to retreat when I realized that I couldn't trust people. I tended to retreat, just sort of rely on my own nous, and my own resilience, because I saw myself too that because Tony was not an involved father, he was very, it was basically because he was of the belief that basically he provides the sperm for the children, but it's the mother that does all the bringing up. So the way I saw it was that my children didn't ask to be born. I'm their stability and security, so I need to basically get my shit together and, put them first, and that's what I did.
That's amazing. I mean, you just like had a spark inside you and nobody else to rely on or back you up, and you just spoke up. I mean, that takes a lot of courage.
Well, I didn't think, it's sort of amazing because, I mean, like even my kids have said, like, what you've done is amazing, Mum. And I suppose I didn't think about it at the time. It was basically, this is what has to be done. It just has to be done. It doesn't matter whether I like it or not, or I agree with it, or whether I'm anxious about it or anything else. This is what needs to be done. So that was what was done. And that was it. But I mean, I look back now and I think, oh my God, I had balls.
That's a lot of courage. I mean, there's speaking up, you kind of know what's going to happen. You're going to be evicted. And then what, and then what's the next step? Did you have a plan in place?
No, I didn't. I didn't. No. Well, I suppose I'd reached such a point where I was just like, I'm done. So I couldn't move physically, but mentally I disengaged from the group. And I kind of like put an armor up and just didn't care what other people thought of me. And I also, look, I don't know how religious people are or aren't, but anyway, I literally I didn't have a plan. I just knew that this was the right thing to do. I was standing up for the values that I believed in, and I wrote the letter. And, the leader himself didn't have the guts or the balls or the backbone to formally evict us. The house and property that we were living on, he was paying the mortgage off. So when I only found this out later, but when I wrote the letters when I wrote the letters that challenged him, he'd actually already been arrested for pedophilia. That had nothing to do with myself or my kids, just to make that clear. That had nothing to do with us. Mm-hmm. So he funneled the mortgage repayments on the property that we were living in to funnel his defence lawyer, right, to support his defence lawyer, which brought about a mortgage repossession. So I began writing these letters in November 2004 from memory, and then we were evicted in August 2006. So the sheriff showed up on my doorstep with mortgage repossession papers, probably about an inch thick. And I knew what a mortgage repossession was, but I didn't know legal jargon, and I didn't have the time to be leafing through, an inch wad of papers. So I just basically said to him, look, just tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it. And he said, well, ma'am, you need to be out in 12 days. I'm like, cool, excellent. I said, this is the news that I wanted to hear. And he was probably a bit shocked, I think. But, in that time of the writing the letters, I basically had faith in God, because in my view, if I stood up for what was right, well, then God would provide somehow. I couldn't see a way, but I decided that, I had faith in God. And I mean, you can call that God, universe, karma, whatever you want, but, I ended up by getting a house. That's not to say that it wasn't stressful. During that time, so between November 2004 and August 2006, at that time, at the beginning in November 2004, I had no access to money. I did not have my own bank account. I did not have an ATM card. I'd never used an ATM. I didn't know how to use an ATM. My welfare payments were going into Tony's bank account, so it was just his bank account. So it gave me time to basically, I lied. One has to sometimes. So Tony was working away for some days at a time. So I used that time to my advantage. So I went into the welfare office and I told them that, like, well, first of all, I went to the bank and I opened up my own bank account. And then I went into the welfare office and I told them that they needed to now move the welfare payments into my bank account. When Tony came back, I told him that the welfare office had called me and said that laws had changed and welfare now needed to be paid into the mother's account, not into the father's account. So I was forced to open my own bank account. Oops, sorry.
Yeah.
So that happened. So I was able to actually use my welfare payments to save some money for, I didn't know when, but just save it. And then Tony was a gambler, and which you'll hear the story in my third TEDx talk of TEDx Norwich, whereby I knew that he was a gambler, and he was, so whatever money went, so his wages and the welfare payments that went into his account, he had a fear of banks and would draw all the money out in cash and only keep like $20 to $50 in there to keep the bank, to keep the account open. So I knew that he was hiding cash somewhere. So when he went away on one of those working trips, you know, where he was away for a few days, as soon as he left, I waited for, like, as soon as he left on the first day, I waited for 2 or 3 hours to make sure he was away and not coming back.
Yeah.
And I went on a search, and I found wads of cash hidden in the cupboard. And I still remember exactly where I was. You know, I was basically kneeling down on the floor of the bedroom and just counting out this money. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. I think it was about, I have to check, but I think it was about 20 grand.
Oh, wow.
And like, but he was gambling. I discovered they'd gambled away $250,000 over 3 years. Yeah. So I did not want to take the cash and then deposit it in my bank account because that would affect my welfare payments. And also I might be forced, like they'd be asking, well, where did this cash come from? Is it like drug money? So, you know, too many questions to be asked. So I basically got a biscuit tin and stuffed it all inside, taped it up, and went outside. And we were living next door to National Park property, which is government-owned property. So I basically went deep in there, dug a big hole with a shovel and buried it. I mean,
Goodness.
it sounds like something out of a movie when I relay it now. Like, I mean, yeah.
But
and
you
then
knew you were going to have
on,
to need it. You would need it, and you're going to have to provide for your kids. I mean, you're
Yeah.
planning a move.
Yeah. So later on, I had a friend, like a family friend, who was a priest, and then so basically later on I dug it up and I gave to him for safekeeping, so that then when Tony came back and he questioned me about it, he said, oh, where's the money? And like initially, because he was gone for like 5 days or something, you know, life had gone on already, you know, and he said, where's the money? And I sort of went, what money? What are you talking about? Because initially I'd forgotten about what I'd done. And then he goes, oh, the money in the cupboard. And I said, well, it's somewhere where you know, neither of us have access. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, neither of us have access. And he was mad as hell. And I mean, I should have been more fearful, but I wasn't. Like, looking back now, you know, like he could have done, you know, being a gambling addict. Mm-hmm. Like like at the time I was very ignorant and naive to like addiction. It's only now that I understand like serious addiction, you know, like gambling, porn, alcohol, whatever, you know, name your addiction. And I should have been more fearful, but I wasn't. I don't know whether that saved me or not, but yeah.
Yeah. Addiction just consumes the person. It really can.
Oh, it does. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Was he ever physical with you?
He was once.
Okay.
And yeah, and I didn't, and see, back then it was just like it was just once. But I mean, you know, now that I know and understand a lot more about coercive control and, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, all these things, like now, like, I really see it for what it was, when I didn't understand what it was back then.
Yeah. And the house you were living in, what was the living conditions like?
It was just an average 3-bedroom house with one bathroom. Like, we were in that time. I have to say, I was blessed to be able to have an actual house on the property next door to the community property, because on the community property there were people living. There were only one. There were only three. There were only three permanent buildings. The rest of them were mobile homes and caravans, and so there were families, like whole families with 7 or 8 kids living in a small mobile home that was so cramped. It was cold in winter. It was horrendously hot in summer. And plus, they were all in next door to each other. At least for us, like the house wasn't fabulous, but I mean, I was separate. So that was a blessing. I saw that as a blessing.
So now that you have come out of it, I know you mentioned before it was hard for you to trust people. Is that still an issue today?
Sometimes, yes. Mainly in terms of men, because I've been, my trust in men has been abused. Let's be real. So yeah, I do have issues with that in terms of like, um, living with someone. And I have a few males in my life that I trust 100%, so that helps. So it's not like I'm a man hater, and I don't want it to come across like that.
Yeah.
It's just that, like, when you've had adverse experiences, negative experiences, that is going to play a part going forward.
Yeah. Is that community still up and going today?
Yes, to a point. There are people who are living there. There's a couple of staunch believers, but there are still people living there that are basically too impoverished to live anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So they've got no choice.
Okay. And then you also mentioned that the world was going to end in 2000. And when it didn't, what was the narrative then?
Well, as with all these groups and seers, it always changes. This is not God's time. We've misunderstood the dates. And also the other one was like time as we understand it, or the centuries as they're counted, is not the way God counts it. So the millennium is not really the millennium. It can be pushed out to God knows when. They always have another narrative that they spin. So that's what they said there. Yes.
And who is they? Like, I'm always curious, like, who is the person making the rules and making like the dates and the narratives that people must follow and believe?
Well, in this case, it was the leader of that group. Now, initially, he was just a normal Catholic that preferred the old ways, the Tridentine Mass and that sort of thing. And then he started prayer groups because one aspect of the Second Vatican Council was that there was a huge decrease in Marianology. So, rosaries, novenas, that sort of thing, pilgrimages. But there were still the old Catholics that really loved that. And so he started prayer groups where, there was regular rosary being said and novenas, and, they started their own pilgrimages and things like that. And that's how he initially started the group. So it was innocent at the beginning. And then he threw in a bit of the, started bringing in a bit of like prophecy. And then it was like, I've had some, little messages from Our Lady. So it was very gradual. And that's what people see. People think that these things just start like, hey, I'm a seer. The Virgin Mary's come to me. They've given me this message. It never happens like that. It's always incremental. And it just, and so that's what people don't understand. It's the behind the scenes story. And so that's how he started. And then, of course, because these people were already attached to saying the rosary and saying the novenas and having the same beliefs and practices, they'd already formed their own little community and little family. And then he throws in, some prophecy into the mix. And it's not like prophecy is unknown in the Catholic Church. You've got, Our Lady of Garabandal, Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Lourdes, all these ones. So it's not unusual. So, you just chuck in a new one. And it just grew from there. And then it was like these messages that he received got bigger and better and longer and, all the rest of it. And, it was, the world was going to end. And then, of course, the thing is that there's a lot, again, this is layered and complex because in Australia, and again, I can only speak from the Australian perspective, but in Australia in the during the 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of emphasis on like this new world order. There was the Cold War. There was a new world order apparently happening. There was interpretations of the Revelation section of the Bible, Revelation or Apocalypse, whichever one you want to call it. And, needless to say, those interpretations, whether they were done by individuals or by the church or whoever, they were erroneously interpreted and spouted as being, there was going to be an antichrist. I was brought up with the belief that the antichrist was actually the son of a priest and a nun who had sex. God knows where this came from. But anyway, the antichrist was going to bring in the 666 that was going to be tattooed invisibly on our foreheads or the back of our hands. And so there were groups of people, which were my parents included, that did not like my mum would not buy products initially that had barcodes on them because that was the beginning of the end. That was subtly saying yes to the Antichrist. So, when we were, when barcodes first came out on products, she just refused to buy them. And then over here in Australia, we had the introduction of the Medicare card. So we have our Medicare, our national health system. And so initially my parents did not want or like the Medicare card because, this was Big Brother watching. And then one of our prime ministers, Bob Hawke, he was, in traditional circles, he was seen as a communist. How they got that idea, I have no idea, but he was seen as a communist. So there was all this layered beliefs, erroneous as they were, and all these wild interpretation of the Bible, and then there was new Marian apparitions happening around the world, and you just throw that in the mix. It's basically throwing it all in the blender, blending it all up, and then coming out with, God knows what. And then, of course, there was going to be a plague, and then we Catholics were obviously better than everybody. We traditional Catholics were better than everybody else. So, if we got the plague, like a lot of the others who were not believers would probably die of the plague. So that sort of got rid of, the riffraff, if you want to put it that way. We were special. But then if we did get the plague, well then picking, drying and storing hawthorn leaves and drinking it as tea would avert the plague. When I think of the stuff I grew up with, I did, you just get used to it as a kid, it's just you just take it on. But I mean, as I talk about it now, people listening are going to be like, what the hell? Like, this is not normal. It's just,
And I'm always interested in the internal dialogue that somebody's having with themselves during these kind of like intense moments. Like when you're burying $20,000, what is going on in your mind?
well, in that instance, like going back to that time, like I was afraid because, you know, I didn't know what Tony's reaction was going to be. I didn't know what my next move was. I was literally in the moment. You know, I didn't know what I was going to say to him, if he'd notice, how would he react? You know, there was that too. So I just saw it as like the next thing to be done in my head. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I said, I didn't have a plan. I wasn't thinking ahead because I didn't know how to think ahead. I wasn't thinking, you know, I'd never been taught to do that. So I didn't think ahead. It was like, well, this is the next thing to be done. And then here's the next thing. And then that follows on the next thing. It wasn't like, well, I'll do this. And then the possible repercussions would be this, this, and this. So now we need to plan for this, this, and this. You know, I just didn't have that.
Yeah. And as far as like, you said you didn't interact with the others in the community.
Well, I did, but to a point, but then as time went on and then I started questioning more, I was seen as a troublemaker and not to, you know, I needed to learn to keep my mouth shut.
But when somebody would tell you that you need to learn to keep you, like, what are you telling yourself?
Well, in that case, I need to keep my eyes and ears open and watch and listen and see what I can find out. That's what I thought. So I learned to just be, again, like an anthropologist, I guess, a silent one, just listening, observing, figuring things out my own way.
But when you're growing up, was there ever like any thoughts going on questioning what you're being told, or you just kind of accepted it?
Because we accepted it. You got to remember that, you know, we were very isolated and insulated, where, you know, growing up as a family. So there was that. And then of course I married Tony, and then, you know, I was still very isolated and insulated with him because I looked to him, and then erroneously, you know, afterwards I realized. And then it was very much and then of course, you know, basically, like, if I am to explain it now, I gave away my power because I didn't even know I had power. You know, I didn't even know I had power. So I gave it away. I placed it in Tony, hoping and praying and expecting him to look after me and look out for me, but he didn't. And then, of course, when I didn't want to move to the community group at all. And then I had to rely on myself. And then, you know, so I've basically given my power away, and I didn't realize I had the power until like only a few years ago, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah. When you were living in the community, did you contact your parents? Were you in constant contact at all?
Yeah, I was in contact with my parents, but at that time there were no mobile phones were only just starting to come out, really. But we had a landline, but we were told that, like, they were tapped. They weren't, but we were told that they were, and I only found out later they weren't. So I didn't talk to my parents a lot. But then there was also that, because my eldest daughter asked me about this recently, and I had trouble. I can verbalize it now, but I didn't know back then. Like, I was angry and resentful at my mother, especially because she was the driving force behind, like, homeschooling us and keeping us isolated and insulated. And I felt angry and resentful. And again, I verbalize this now. I didn't recognize it back then. You know, like, I blamed her for, like me having to do all this work. And so I didn't keep great contact with them for many years because I just, we were told that the phones were tapped, but also, I just didn't have a lot to tell her or really to talk about. And she was also she was very closed off, and she also has this attitude of like, well, we are your parents, and then when we get married, we're given special gifts from God to be parents and know everything. Well, whatever. I mean, I don't believe that. And she was not supportive when I got divorced from Tony. She basically told me that you made your bed, so you lie in it. So it was, there was a lot of things there, but it's only since doing my own healing and having my own psychologist, but also I've done a lot of reading around religious trauma and trauma in general. And I see that my parents were two very traumatized individuals that came together and just fumbled their way through life because they just didn't know any better. And so that's helped. And so I have a better relationship with them now to a point. But I tend to just be less judgy, I suppose. And don't blame them, as much, because I mean, that's the other thing too. You can be a victim in that way too, where you're like, well, I blame my parents. And I mean, I'm over 18, I could blame my parents before I was 18, but now I have the agency and independence to change my own life. And I don't have to believe everything they say, So it's very, so you don't have to be a victim of that. You can start to see your parents for their own frailties and gaps, gaps in knowledge and all the rest of it. It's actually very interesting to go back when I've gone back to visit them, and you just see, I see mum's resigned resentfulness about having to look after dad, and, those sighs. And when I ask her what's wrong, and she's like, oh, just offering it up to Jesus. I'm like, oh my God. And I just think, ugh, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Was she comforting to you when you were growing up?
No, she tended to be more, I've seen her as being more along narcissistic lines, which makes sense because those men that I've had in my life have been narcissistic. So again, learning curve, when you start learning about narcissism and coercive control and psychological emotional abuse, these things, it puts a whole lot more things into perspective. Yeah.
And when you were starting to kind of live amongst general population, what was the most intriguing thing you've come across or noticed? Or
well, initially I found it very difficult because I used to say that the world smacked me in the face, which is true, but I didn't have an identity. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I liked, what I disliked. I had no fashion sense. I knew I was backward educationally, socially. When people were talking about popular books, movies, TV shows, went straight over my head. I didn't know what they were talking about because I'd not watched these movies, that were popular during the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It all passed me by. All that, I knew of a few basics here and there because I'd seen it on the news, but I didn't actually know the culture. So I knew that I was very backward. And so I just set about doing the best that I could, because I also realized that if I did not change, I would lose my children. And when I say lose them, I meant I knew, I couldn't verbalize it back then, but I can now. I knew that my children would outgrow me, and they would leave home and not want to come back to visit. and I desperately wanted a relationship with all of my children. And I therefore set about wanting to change, wanting to explore. And I remember one of the things was sex outside of marriage, because there was huge emphasis placed on women within the traditional Catholic group. You have to be a virgin. You have to be a virgin when you get married. You have to be in a white dress. You have to be privileged enough to have the veil over your face, which shows that you're a virgin. Like, now I know that all this is just patriarchal bullshit, like it is. And, it's okay for the men to sow their wild seeds. We just won't talk about it, And, of course, there's no repercussions for them. But sadly for us, one slip and we're pregnant, and abortion is not an option. It's terrible. And I remember sitting on the bed one day and thinking, thinking that I wanted to explore my own sexuality. And it was just, I remember sitting on the bed and thinking, okay, I've been taught that, having sex outside of marriage is a sin. I was told that by my mother, who was told that by old white celibate men who have never had relationships in their lives. So basically, what authority do they have? Like, years later, when I visited a psychologist and I told her my systematic analytical thinking of how I actually went through it, she goes, "Who taught you that?" And I said, "Myself," because it just made obvious sense. Like, just to literally question, then go back, who told you? Where did they get it from? What authority do they have? It just went back like that. And I basically thought, well, so it's supposedly a mortal sin to have sex outside of marriage. But then, I was looking at that point, I was then attending like the local Catholic church, and it was like, well, there's all these other people that, these other couples, they're Catholic too, and they're living together. They're clearly having sex before they're getting married. They're getting married in white dresses and long veils. God's clearly not cutting them down because they're doing it. Yeah. So what's the deal here, And then it started, then I started then I was questioning, what I was brought up with. I was questioning like the beliefs that I was brought up with. Then it was like, well, I want to explore this for myself. I don't want to feel, I don't want to be caught in this, it's a mortal sin. I'm going to hell, the guilt, the judgment. So it was a slow process, but I literally did that with everything. Like literally just asking myself these analytical questions. And my psychologist says to me, she said, "You're the most analytical, curious person that I've ever worked with."
But it probably really served you well to be that way. I mean, it's helped you grow like tremendously. And so you said you were evicted in 2006.
Yes. Yeah.
And then when were you divorced from?
Divorced from him in early 2008.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've grown a lot.
Yes, I have. And it's just been, every year that goes past, it's like, I just think, wow. I look back at my younger self and it's just like, wow. And I mean, my kids do remind me from time to time, they go, do you realize, and I'm like, well, no, I never sat down to actually realize. And they're going, well, you should, and it is true. I look back now and I think, my God, like, I don't even know what I was thinking. The thing is that I didn't have a plan. I literally like, well, this needs to be done. So I just did it. And I was naive enough and ignorant enough to literally just go through with it. I didn't think about the consequences. Like, I mean, that's not always a good thing. I don't advise that, clearly. I managed to be safe somehow, like when I took that money from Tony, like, I mean, he could have lashed out in a very physical way and it may not have ended well. But like I said, I didn't understand like the serious nature of addiction and that this can actually cause men to be violent. I did not know that. Yeah. So it could not have ended well. So for those listening, I don't advise just being bullheaded and doing it. I mean, I was blessed and lucky. That's how I see it.
But you were strong-willed. That's what I see. I see you as like the definition of resilient.
Well, I've been told that, yes. And I do have that. I have to say that, you know, I've reached in certain points in my life, I have reached the, you know, like there's always been like a little fire in my heart and soul that just, you know, I'm not taking this bullshit any longer. And basically, F you, I'm doing my own thing.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I've done. And I've just found, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And I always found a way.
So where do you see yourself in 5 years?
With a PhD in anthropology.
Doing what with that?
Well, what intrigues me is, you know, again, this comes from a very personal space in terms of like, well, I haven't nutted it out to a single thing. There's probably like, you know, I'll be doing research till I'm 100. So, hey, I initially wanted to share my story because so many people were asking questions about me and like how I did it, and also how, like, what's the internal workings of these groups that people call cults, you know. And I realized that people were they had no idea of what it was really like to be on the inside. And so that's why I wrote my book, because I wanted to show like how these groups work and why people join them. Because a lot of people just see a TV documentary and go, yeah, I wouldn't be so stupid, really. And, you know, that's a big statement and you shouldn't say it. Yeah. And then, you know, like, also when I left in 2006, I didn't know anybody like myself. I was the dumb one. I was. And I'll say that. You know, I was socially backward. I was educationally backward. I knew I was backward. I knew I was weird. I knew I was different and I didn't fit in. And it was hard for me. And I didn't know anybody else like myself. And honestly, like, ever since I've been speaking publicly, like, I've had so many women just sort of reach out and go, oh my God, thank goodness, you know, like, I came across your talk. Like, now I know I'm not the only one. And, you know, that was the reason why I shared it, because it was like, I want other women out there to know they're not the only one and it's okay. And also to help the wider world to understand that, like, there are other people, and it's men too, that come out of these groups and, you know, they're the weird ones. And people want, you know, like, they go to get a job and it's like, well, you've got a weird backstory. I don't understand the weird backstory. There's something sus going on there. No, there's not something sus going on there. It's just that, like, we're trying to deal, you know, like, our background will always be part of our identity. And you can't get rid of that. You've got to find the gold and bring that with you. That's how I see it. So, like, initially, many people, when they leave these groups, they don't, you know, it's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't want to be seen, associated, anything with that group. I feel embarrassed, humiliated, because I'm so far behind the rest of the world. But the thing is, like, it's always going to be it's always going to be part of your identity. Mm-hmm. You know, like, as I mentioned to you before with Catholicism, I'm non-practicing now, but I chose not to practice, but I've cherry-picked the things that I like. I love the Gregorian chant. I love visiting churches. I love the smell. I love the candles. I love the little sanctuary lamp. These things are comforting and familiar to me. And so I'm choosing what I want to take with me. So Catholicism will always be part of my identity. And I've embraced it now, rather than just going, I'm not Catholic anymore. I'm quite happy to be half Catholic, half Protestant. That works for me. Yeah. Cool, you know. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to be able to help others to be able to embrace their weirdness and their backstory, and to see the, you know, to choose, to pick and choose the parts that they liked. Because the way I see it too is that my journey has made me who I am today. You know, I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for my journey. And it has taught me a lot of resilience. It's taught me a lot of courage. And, you know, I'm proud of that. And, you know, I had an academic say to me, you know, a few weeks ago when we were chatting, and he goes, I just see you as the epitome of resilience. Like, you've literally, like, you know, you always find a way.
Yeah.
And, you know, he said, your book too is not like, he said a lot of them are misery memoirs. And he said, yours is not a misery memoir. It's very much a, you know, it's very much a shining light. And I mean, that's the best, like, feedback I could ever get, because I've never wanted to be a victim, and I never saw myself as a victim, because once you're a victim, there's always the poor me. Let's blame everybody else. Like, you know, and they, again, they give their power back. They leave their power with, like, the, you know, the community leader or the group leader. Oh, it's his fault, or, you know, he did this, he forced us to do that. Okay, yes, back then, like, you know, you did follow those rules and you fell into that. But now that you're out, you've got the power to change. Don't leave your power with them. You know, you can move on. You can, like, recreate yourself. You've got that power now. And so I've always seen myself as like, okay, this did happen to me, but what can I do now? You know, what can I do now moving forward? How can I change my circumstance?
You felt socially awkward. How did you go about working towards not feeling that way? Like, how did you practice socially?
Well, now that I study anthropology, I realized that I was an anthropologist all along before I even knew it was a discipline. I would accept invitations out, you know, like when people invited me to a barbecue or into an outing, and, like, finding appropriate dress, because obviously, you know, people just dress, you know, in, like, runners, jeans, a nice shirt or a t-shirt, jacket. You know, I had none of those things. I did not know initially, because I was taught, you know, you don't wear trousers or jeans. So, like, that caused me a lot of angst in knowing what to wear in order to fit in. And I mean, you know, there were some weird fashion choices initially, but I mean, hey, you know, we're all learning.
Yeah.
But I would literally, like, observe. Like, I would listen to what people were saying, their topics of conversation. I would observe people's actions, reactions, and then take mental notes of, like, okay, I didn't understand what they meant when they were talking about this. So I would, you know, go searching for it in a book, or maybe, you know, if I did make a couple of friends, and so I would ask them later, like, what did so-and-so mean by this? Like, what's that? I've not heard of that before. And so that's how I started. And I mean, yeah, now I realize that I was an anthropologist all along, because that's what anthropology is. It's actually injecting yourself into the culture and just, like, listening, observing, writing notes, you know, asking questions, you know, that sort of thing. So that's what I did. And that's how I learned.
Were you anxious? Internally anxious? Did you feel any of that
very.
Going out to these outings?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Especially around dress. And then, but I mean, like, I was taught good manners when I was growing up. So, you know, like, you know, there were certain manners to be observed. So I knew those. So that was good. But I was, yeah, I mean, you know, other things, you know, like the dress code, topics of conversation. I learned pretty quickly that money, religion, and politics doesn't, you know, they're not great topics. Although now I've gotten a bit more playful. I like to throw a bomb in the conversation and just sit back and just watch and see how people react and act, you know, because I mean, I'm very neutral when it comes to politics. I don't give a shit who you vote for. I just want to throw a bomb in there and just see, you know, and people are just like, they fall for it every time, and they're like, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
And you're like, yeah, you're emotionally immature, but hey. I think people get too head up about it. Like, I mean, honestly, why not have a conversation? Why can't we have a grown-up, calm conversation about it? Like, literally just being curious and asking questions. Mm-hmm. Why do we have to be diehards and blinkered?
Yeah. They associate themselves with that group and all the beliefs within that group. There's a very good book I've read recently, and it's called The Status Game by Will Storr. Have you ever heard of that one?
Right. No, I haven't. No.
It talks about human behavior and why people behave the way they do. And I mean, I strongly recommend that one because he really gives like a narrative to all the gray area of life. Like, why do people kill others? You know, why do people like put so much of themselves into a group and identity into a group? So it's just been very interesting. And now that I've read that book, I kind of see the world in a different light.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the thing. People are looking for inclusion, they're looking for identity, they're looking for community. And again, like I said before, religion does often provide that. And that can be any. It can be Catholicism, it can be Islam, it can be Buddhism, it can be Hinduism, it can be anything. So please don't judge people when you're looking at a documentary and going, well, you know, they're stupid. Why would they join something like that? Everybody has different insecurities and everybody is looking for a community to identify with. They're looking, and sometimes people are just testing this out. And then, you know, when they become, when they join the group, they might still have questions. But then the group leader or the group hierarchy, you know, give them the answers that they want to hear.
Back to when you first come out and you got a divorce, were you an open book from the beginning about your past?
No, I was not. I was incredibly embarrassed and humiliated that I'd actually been involved, especially with that last group, because the leader was eventually jailed for pedophilia. And I just didn't want to be, and because I was living in that town, so that community lived outside of the town, and then I moved into the town, and like everybody knew about the group, like they knew that it was there, but they didn't actually understand like the beliefs, the practices, and everything else. It was just weird. So initially, when my kids started attending the Christian school in Nowra, because Nowra is a defence town, there's an army and navy there, and air force. And so I was initially, because I, you know, showed up at the school one day, it wasn't just assumed that I was, you know, my partner was in defence or I was in defence and I'd moved there. But it became increasingly more difficult because they'd say, oh, you know, how long you been here in Nowra, you know? I mean, how do you say, well, I've been in the area for 10 years, but, but it became increasingly difficult to actually like say, well, I've been in the area for 10 years, but this is my first outing, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
And then I honestly thought that people would be like, oh my God, she's a weird one, and just walk away. But they didn't. They were actually really curious. They're like, oh my God, we know about that group. It's been there for X amount of years. And, you know, like, you know, we see media articles come out, but, you know, like what really goes on there? Like, why do people join? Like, you know, they wanted to know. And I thought, oh, like people don't actually know what goes on. And then initially people were saying, oh, why don't you write a book? And I sort of went, whatever, because, you know, you live your life in your head. You know, you just do these things and you just don't think anything of it. Like, as we said before, like, you know, I just did things because they needed to be done. I wasn't looking at it as being like, oh, this is amazing, this is brave, this is courageous. Like, none of that entered my head. It was just like, this is what needs to be done and we're doing it. But then as more people started asking questions and saying, no, really, you should, I thought, oh, okay. So that's what I did. And then it was good because it helped me. Like, I had no idea how to write a book. So I literally just put down like the year, you know, and then just expanded on it and then just wrote it more. And then I got someone to edit it for me. And then I self-published. So I've got my own rights over my own book, over my own story. And then my kids have said to me, you need to write a second one. I'm like, yeah, I know, but I haven't got to that yet.
How long did it take you to write the first book?
Oh, well, bear in mind that it wasn't like I wasn't at this for hours at a day. I took my time. It took me probably 5 years. So yeah, but I didn't have an end date. Like I didn't have an end date and I would just add to it, like I wasn't strictly strategic in how I wrote. It'd be very different with the second one because I'd be like, okay, this is, I obviously have more experience now, and obviously with my university experience as well, it'd be a much more kind of regimented timetable rather than just being like an open kind of timetable.
So you just become more opened over time then?
Well, I have, yes. And it's also been good for me because every single interview, like I have done a lot of interviews, and I don't say that as being like, look how many interviews I've done. I I enjoy being interviewed because I always get asked different questions. There's always different questions. There's always a different perspective. So, and I always learn. Like every single interview I give, there's like I've learned more. I've peeled off another layer. I have a deeper understanding about something, and so I see it as a learning thing too when I get interviewed.
You're single and going to school full time.
Yes, yes.
Okay. And do your kids live close to you?
No, they live all over Australia and one in Bali. So I do have one that lives here in Brisbane and another one on the Sunshine Coast, which is 2 hours north of Brisbane. But the rest live around Australia and, yeah, one in Bali.
Are they happy that you chose to move? Or
Oh,
that you were
yeah,
evicted?
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely. They were thrilled. Like because it happened on a Friday afternoon when the sheriff showed up, like before the kids came back from school. And so when they came back from school, I said, "Oh, guess who we got visited by?" And they said, I gave them three guesses and they couldn't guess. And then when I told them the sheriff and I said, "We've got 12 days to move," they were like high-fiving. They were so happy. Um, and the three older ones were 16, 15, 14 at the time. And they're just like, right, let's get this done. And we sorted our stuff into keep, rubbish, charity. And we were just very systematic about it. So, yeah.
And when you first moved, Tony stayed with you guys for the first couple of years?
Well, he was working away. So he'd come back only for one night each weekend or every second weekend, which was fine. So I was basically a single mother with the kids. And that worked fine because we were like the Musketeers, one for all for one. And we made it work. It was actually a lot easier to have 8 kids and myself than it was to have a husband because, like, he was just a Debbie Downer. And, of course, I was a terrible woman for having, taken charge of the family. So, there's dire consequences for that in the next life, whatever. But he was, yeah. And so, I'd become less of a woman because now I was in charge and dominant and making decisions that I shouldn't. And I'm just like, cool. Well, you go work. See you later. And I'll handle things here. And like, it was good. The kids and I, I taught them all to drive. So it took me 15 years to teach all the kids to drive. So taught them to drive one by one. And then, they would help while the older ones were still at home. They'd help me out. And, they started getting part-time jobs and, that sort of thing. So it was very, it was good. It was good. It was a lot easier to do things together.
Yeah. Did they adjust into the new school easily?
Yeah, the school was very, very good. All of the teachers and the principal and everything were very understanding of the background, and then all of the other parents, were like they were. It was a Christian school, so it was very much a community, but a healthy community. And so they were very, very good in being able to help the children to adjust. So other parents encouraged their children to include my children and, like be inclusive and understanding and all that sort of thing. And so it was a soft landing for them. So that was good.
Nice. I mean, wow. You have
I
been
know,
through,
I know.
it is. It's a remarkable story. I mean, you have experienced so much that a lot of people just don't know. That it's not relatable at all. But that resilience in you and wanting to move forward and just not letting anything weigh you down, like you just seek success almost in everything. Any problem you see, you go forth and see what you can do to make it better.
Yeah, but see, ultimately, like I think that if I didn't have children, I wouldn't have been as so one-eyed and determined. But because I so wanted a different life for my kids, like that's all that there was, that's all that there was. So it was just, I basically got not dragged along by them, but, I always wanted to be a better version of myself. And I mean, I became a better parent as I went along as well, and I changed my views on parenting and because I always saw my teenagers as like adults in training. So, and home needs to be a safe place for them to sort of like push the boundaries a bit. So then, they've got the safety and security of their parents or parent. So, yeah. And I mean, my kids are close and I'm very proud of each and every one of them because like I've got one in defence, one was in defence. So I've had two of my sons serve our country for nearly a bit over 20 years collectively. So I've got a son-in-law that's also in defence. So in our family, we've probably served the country for a collective at least 30 years, and that's a lot in one family for me being so young as well. All of my kids hold down good jobs. They're every employer that they've been at, like the employer has been sad to see them go and has always offered them a job back at any time. They're all kind and thoughtful and understanding. They have an excellent work ethic, and people have always complimented me on them. And, I'm proud of that because 8 kids is a lot to bring up by yourself, but I'm proud of each and every one of them, each and every one.
You're almost going to bring me into tears because
I'm sorry.
I mean, I too am a mother of 2, and they push you. They are my reason why for everything. Like I can relate to you on that. Like anything I want to go after, knowing there's a possibility for better for them just pushes you that much more. And
it does.
It's just, and it's unexplainable. Like, I don't think there's any words that can explain that extra push they give you to do better and more. And I think like you are truly an inspiration to a lot of women.
Thank you.
With all the challenges you've been through and how far you've come.
It hasn't been easy. But it's only over the last few years where I've more like really taken that into account. Because before it was just like the next thing, you know what I mean? I was always striving because I just always felt like I was behind the 8 ball. I was behind my peers. I was just behind. I seemed behind. So I was always determined to learn. determined, motivated, disciplined to learn. But, you know, I need, you know, I mean, this is advice to myself as well. You know, we need to accept where we're at, you know, for those of us who have had this kind of background, and like embrace our background instead of trying to erase it. Because too many of us, you know, like I did in the beginning, I wanted to erase everything. I didn't want to be associated with that fundamentalist group ever again. But, you know, I didn't have the understanding, like the emotional capacity at the time, or the understanding to be able to understand it and deal with it. I just didn't have that. But now I do. And so it's been a learning process, and, you know, peeling back the layers. There's always more layers to peel back, you know, like even with victim thinking, like I always consciously chose not to be a victim. But then sometimes you catch yourself out and you think, what the hell? You know, like, you know, if you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it's like, I'm saying with my words that I'm not a victim, but hey, I'm falling into this trap of like the poor me. It's like, hey, pull yourself up, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. What can you do to make it better?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
So your initial goal was to give your kids a better life, and it seems like you accomplished that.
Yes, I have, you know. Mm-hmm. So, well, I mean, they're aged 34 down to 20 now. So, you know, all adults, but yeah, they're pretty amazing.
Well, when you went overseas for your schooling, how was that experience?
Well, I went to the Netherlands, which is quite different to Australia, because clearly they all speak English, but I mean, obviously Dutch is the first language. And it's like, you know, when I first landed, and then, you know, hadn't slept for like 36 hours. And then I went, you know, I thought, nah, I'm going to be a real tourist. I'm going to get a train ticket and I'm going to catch the train from Schiphol Airport to Amsterdam. And I bought the ticket, and then I'm just looking at where the train, you know, like the screens, and I'm like, oh my God, like what the hell? I don't know which way is north or west, east, south, like, ugh. And then, and I thought, like, you know, for a nanosecond, I was thinking, what the hell have I done? Like, what have I done?
What have I got myself into?
Yeah. And then I thought, whoa, hold up. You haven't slept for 36 hours. You need a shower, you need to eat, and you need sleep. So let's get that done first. So that's the next step. So I basically made it to my accommodation. I just thought, I need to have a shower, I need to go and eat, and then I need to sleep. And then tomorrow's another day. And so that's what I did. And then I spent 3 glorious days in Amsterdam, literally just wandering around. I mean, yes, I could have used Google Maps, but I just thought, no, I want to go out and immerse myself into the city. And I just literally wandered around. And then, you know, I came across the Jewish Quarter. I'm very interested in Judaism as well. Came across the Jewish Quarter. And, you know, I saw the museum there. And like my first, you know, because I've spent so much time working and like not going for holidays and stuff like that, I thought, oh, you know, I'm going to be here for 6 months. I'll put this on the list to go and see. That was my first thought. And I'm like, whoa, hold up. I got nowhere else to be. Get in there. So I went in there and spent like 3 or 4 hours just literally just wandering around and just like reading the history and looking at the exhibits and everything. It was amazing. And then so I spent time in Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales. I went to Barcelona, Florence, Rome, Cannes, Paris, Brussels, and a number of places around the Netherlands. So I visited, you know, I didn't just go to Amsterdam, because a lot of people make they go to Amsterdam and they go, oh, I've been to the Netherlands. No, you haven't. I lived in Utrecht because I went to Utrecht University. So, you know, I know Utrecht quite well, and I visited a number of other like cities and villages. So, you know, and each one has their personality, and it actually got to be, now I didn't learn to speak Dutch. I didn't make an attempt because they say that speaking Dutch is like speaking German with a throat infection. So I didn't. So I got to know some words, like when I read it, like Hof means hoof. So if you see a street that has Hof on the end of it, it actually means a cul-de-sac. You know what I mean? So I just sort of, things like that. But I can't understand anybody. I can't understand a conversation that's being spoken in Dutch. But like it became such a natural hum in the background to hear Dutch that when I visited Liverpool at the end of my trip, I was kind of like, whoa, wait, everybody speaks English. The signs are in English, menus are in English, everything's in English. Like, what? This is like not normal,
Yeah.
So part of my brain sort of didn't have to work as hard in figuring out where to go and all that sort of thing. But I loved every minute of it, I just embraced it. And like every new place I went, I just would immerse myself in that village, in that town, in that city, and just like get a feel for it rather than have a list of like, I've got to see this, 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 and this, and just sort of going to each one. I was like, okay, these are the main things that I'd like to see if I can see them. But then I came across a lot of things that, like in Rome, I visited like 20 to 25 churches. That was not like, they weren't on my list. It was basically like, oh, hey, there's a church. Let me just wander in, and like, oh, wow, oh, hang on, there's another one. Okay. And so I would just do that. Like, yes, I visited St. Peter's Basilica because that was part of a tour. I mean, mind-boggling. But I visited a lot of these other little churches that nobody even heard about. I just went in and, and then I happened to see, there's some ancient mural in there. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go in there and check that out, but it wasn't on a list of like, I have to see this, this, and this, and let me see how much I can slam into 4 days or whatever, because for me, that's not how you are able to travel. Like you can travel like that, but it's not immersing yourself in that culture and in that city. And like, I didn't have a car, so I bought public transport and walked. Like I would walk up to 5 to 7 kilometers a day when I was, because you just do,
Yeah. Just going. Do you have any fears going forward?
No, because I mean, you just, you have to just walk forward and just take each experience as it comes, you just have to, because like, I've met people who, they're afraid of change. They're afraid to walk through the fire, as I put it. And I just see that as being like, either you can walk through the fire and change, or you can like just cower in the corner and like not live life for real, and for me, like, there have been times when I've been afraid of like change, but I mean, it's really the fear that you conjure up in your head rather than the actual event. And you just need to, like, I guess I'm just like that. And I mean, my psychologist knows that too. She said, like, like I'll go to her and I'll say, okay, Katie, I've read this, practiced that, journaled this, done this, this, and this, and I'm at an impasse. What do I do now? Teach me,
Yeah.
Because I just see that, like, if we don't change, we end up in just being like a root-bound plant. And you're literally just lifting it from one side of the veranda to the other side. For what? Pouring a bit of water on it and hoping it'll grow. No, you need to wrench that out of the pot. You need to loosen up all of the roots. You need to sometimes trim the roots. You need to put in fresh soil in a bigger pot and somewhere else, like more sun or whatever, for it to thrive, and add in some plant food. And I mean, that's what we need to do with our own minds. It's also what we consume in our minds. And I don't watch the news. So some people say, oh, did you see what's, like I didn't even know that there was an assassination attempt on Trump. I literally just saw a picture of him pop up with something on his ear, and then I saw the word assassination. So like, I just don't consume the news because it's so depressing, it's so negative, and it's so biased. I've had experience of that myself early in my speaking career, where you get that yellow journalism. There's the behind the scenes, and then front of scenes. And so I'm just very I'm just like, when I want to know news, I want to search it out myself from reputable sources, but don't just feed it to. I don't want that. I want to do it my way. And it's very much what you consume. And if you're always consuming shit, what do you expect your brain to be?
I agree. I don't watch the news either. I haven't for years now. It just doesn't give me a good feeling inside, and I'm always, who is behind the narrative? And a lot of times I feel like manipulating the masses in a big way. So
yeah, there's a lot of it depends on who owns the network, what do they want, what's their narrative. It's all of that, and I just don't want a bar of it. And I mean, we can opt out of hearing the news. And I don't like it when people automatically turn the TV on, it's news. Why? Stop consuming it. Like I said, if I want to know, I will go looking.
What advice would you give to somebody who has just left a cult?
To be gentle with themselves, and be gentle with yourself, and don't beat yourself up, and don't be so quick to rid yourself of that narrative. Like, allow it to sit and brew like a cup of tea, because you can be so quick to disaffiliate yourself from a group or a practice or both, that your identity builds over time, and you need to find time to just be and just allow yourself, because often in these, when you've just left, you're obviously in flight or fight mode, and you need to just be safe and be relaxed and just gradually move from one step to another, rather than be like, right, I need to completely change my life. I need to step away from all that. I don't believe or practice or anything of that, and this is the new me. But then it's like, well, who is the new me? Because my identity has all been tied up in that group and its rituals, beliefs, and practices. You're not suddenly a new me. It builds over time, and it's okay to not know. It's literally okay to not know. And yeah, be careful who you also consume from, because I mean, there's also people who leave these groups who are, as I term, bitter and twisted, and then they start their own support group that ends up in being like no better than the group they just left, because they're all bitching and moaning and in victim mode and trying to blame the past group and past leader. And as we spoke before, you've left that. You now have the freedom and the agency to change in your own way, at your own pace.
You mentioned you see a psychologist. When did you reach out to start speaking to somebody?
Well, I've been with Katie now since 2017, but like I saw counsellors before that. But I see it as an ongoing journey, because another thing I've found with people who leave, like initially, they have trouble trusting people, which I understand, but then, they might think, they don't do anything for ages, and then they do go and see somebody, and then they think, oh, I'm all good now, and then that's it. But you've got to see this as an ongoing journey. And, you might visit your psychologist, 10 times in 1 year, and then the next year you might think, oh, I only need 2 to 4 visits, and that's fine. But I think that you always need to have like an ongoing relationship with someone that you trust and that you get on with. As Esther Perel says, you need someone to kick you and stroke you. So equal parts, being a bit sort of like, okay, you can move on from that or whatever, to, being really understanding of your past. So it's very, I think it's absolutely a must to have an ongoing psychologist.
Mm-hmm. I agree. They just almost help you see things differently.
They do.
Mm-hmm. And
they do.
I took a class once because I have a bachelor's in human services along with my nursing bachelor's. For my human service bachelor's, we had to interview people. And a lot of times when you're seeing a counselor, the way you're taught at the university is you just kind of restate what they're saying. You mirror whatever the person's saying in a different way. And they have all their own answers already. You just help them restate what they're saying. And then they seem to think the counselor's giving them the answers, but you've known all along.
Yes. And it's just that you need to clear away like the debris to be able to hear it. But a book that I have found helpful actually is it's called Leaving the Fold by Marlene Winnell. And it's an amazing book, and I strongly recommend it for anybody who's leaving any kind of religion or group. She's a psychologist, and she grew up in fundamental Christianity. And she started in her practice, she started to see like that people that were having issues with depression, a lot of them came from religion, and they hadn't sorted through, like there was not always like abuse, but they still felt that guilt and judgment and manipulation from religion, even though they'd left. And that was at the root of their issues, and they didn't realize it. And then she found that by working through her own things that she helped others. But it's great because she's got a lot of questions in there as well, like and she's got a great table in there, like if you're feeling this, this, it comes from whatever, and so I found it very helpful to read through that, so people can, there are resources out there if you know what to look for, but she is one that I really admire. And there's another one called Degrees of Separation. Now this is based on Hasidic Jews. It's called Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Leaving Ultra-Orthodox Judaism by Zelman Newfield. Now, it is Jewish, mainly, but this little book, you can only get it from Temple University Press. It's he interviewed 74 Hasidic Jews who had left Hasidic Judaism. So this little book is actually his PhD thesis, very easy to read. But he also suggested that this book be used for people who are divorcing, migrants, refugees, people who are leaving defence, because it's so, like, the question, he has all the questions in the back that he asked his interviewees. So it's a fabulous book, and it's like, when I was reading it, like, I actually was, I've got so many markers in this book, it's almost as thick. But I saw so many parallels with my own experience, and of course, and I've actually recommended it to other people who I know, other women who I know, and they're just like, oh my God, like, I was asking myself all these questions as well. And so it's really helped me. So they're two books that I strongly recommend, because people can go, like, there's a lot of iffy books out there, but these two I've really found have really helped me a lot. And if you can get your hand on good resources from the beginning, that helps. Because if I'd found these books early in my journey, it would have accelerated my growth.
Mhm.
But I didn't find them until later. So I've only known about these books for the past probably 3 years.
Okay.
But yeah, if I had have known earlier, it would have helped me so much more.
I'll find images of them on the internet and make sure I tie them into
Yeah,
this
please
portion of
do.
the podcast
Yeah.
too. I will, just so that people will know
Yeah.
what to look for. You said the one was degrees of separation, what was the second portion of the title?
Identity formation
Identity
while
formation. Okay.
while leaving ultra orthodox Judaism.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely tie those into it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, because it really, I like to give these resources because if people can get hold of them and read them, like they're easy reading. You don't have to have a degree to read them. It's very easy to read. And then, of course, they have resources in there as well that you could look up yourself. But like, especially Marlene Winnell, like just for general religion or, whatever, evangelical or Christianity or whatever, it's, the questions she's got in there are very, like, you can use it for whichever one you're leaving, It's very good.
And my goal for this podcast is just to try to help people. I mean, people can relate to other stories, different portions of them, just the will to want to do better in life. And if it has helped you, I'm sure it'd be worth the read. So.
Yes. Well, Well, I mean, when I first left, when I was 36 and I first left that community, and I didn't know, like, I knew I needed to learn, but I didn't know how to find things. So I started reading autobiographies, because that's what really started to help me. And when it came to the sex, Billy Connolly's wife, Pamela Stevenson, she studied as a psychologist, and she actually wrote 2 big books. One was on mental health and one was on sex. And I can't remember, the sex one, I think, is the title of Sex, but I can't remember the subtitle. But like, it's a big tome of a book. But she did like this whole sex study. And because I wanted to know, like, what is this supposed shame about sex? On the one hand, as Catholics, strict Catholics, were taught, there's this beauty around the marital act. But then it's sinful to do outside of marriage. Like, it's like, what's going on here? And I remember I literally got that book of Pamela Stevenson out from the library, and I read the whole thing from cover to cover. And like, I don't remember most of it, but one thing I do remember is that she said that we are sexual beings, and like, she literally goes through all the stages of our sexual, how can I say, growth, curiosity, experiences, or whatever. And she said that if you've got to go through the certain stages, because that's the way we evolve and that's the way we grow. And she said, if you miss any of those, you have to go back and go through them, because it's just part of how we are. So if you've missed the whole, like, teenage sexual exploration, you need to go work, you need to experience that / work through it at some point. It's not like, well, I missed out on it and then I jumped 2 sections of life and I'm here now. It's like, yeah. So, I looked for things like that, and I read, I read her book on mental health. I read her book on sex. Like, I looked for things to educate myself on, and that's what I did.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoy your story. So you're a strong woman. You are a very strong woman. So
thank you.
And I am grateful that you agreed to speak with me.
Well, like I said, I like to do podcast interviews because I prefer the long form. Because when somebody, when a journalist contacts me and goes, oh, can you do a 5-minute skit? for some news. And I'm like, no, because A, the story's too big, and B, they always stuff it up. They always mix up. They go, oh, you were part of two cults. No, I wasn't part of two cults. Like, they're two fundamental groups that are somewhat interconnected, yet separate, you know? And if you don't have that long form, you can't explain it. And they always, you know, they just want a sensationalist headline, and I'm not going to give that to you. So I just go, no. You know, you need to look at the history of the group. And this goes for journalists as well, because journalists are, I dislike a lot of journalists because they tend to just label a group a cult and then use that awful word brainwashing. There is no such thing as brainwashing. We need to stop the use of that word. Now, cult is not really used anymore in academic terms because it gives a negative connotation because of Waco and Jonestown. So we tend to use new religious movements or fundamentalist group or sect rather than cult. But, you know, there's not any brainwashing that goes on, because at every stage, generally almost at every stage, people have a choice. But remember that they make a choice on the information at hand and also their current vulnerability / questioning at the time. Now, you know, I can take the examples of my mother. You know, she'd grown up in, you know, she'd grown up very Catholic. Then she joined the convent. And then she joined at a time before Vatican II. So it was very traditional. That was comforting. That was familiar. You know, that was her life. And then she left. She had to leave because of ill health. And then, you know, she got married because that was the next best thing. And then when traditionalism was reintroduced, like, of course she went for it because it was comforting. It was familiar. It reminded her of her old life. You know, she found fulfillment in that. And then, like with Tony, like, he had this interest in, like, prophecy, you know, end of world theories and all that. So, of course, when he met the leader of that that community, like, that's all he was like looking at. He didn't make any judgment on the whole group. He was only listening out for the answers that he wanted. So it was a choice for him to move there and to take us there. It was a choice, but it was a restricted choice. So that's what I mean when people, it's so easy for people to just sit and watch a documentary and just go, well, I would never do that. I would never join a group like that. You don't know that.
Yeah. It could happen to anyone. So when you say the word cult, what is your definition?
There's always a negative connotation. People use the word cult really rose out of Waco and Jonestown, and that's why it's not used in academic terms anymore. And I do not like the word because as soon as you say cult, people have that automatic thought that, you know, there's going to be a homicide or a mass suicide or something like that. So that's why I tend not to use it. And it's also because journalists put cult and brainwashing together, and I hate it because there is no such thing as brainwashing. If we go back to what, you know, how brainwashing started, it started in the 50s in America by journalists that, you know, basically erroneously deciphered what they thought, you know, was a hip and happening thing. But in reality, there is no brainwashing. You can't brainwash someone. If that was the case, we'd all be doing it to each other. Let's be real. Like I said before, there are these, you know, you have choices. You know, you choose to go and explore that group. You choose to, you know, look into it and see what its beliefs are. And then it depends on your whole mentality at the time. Like, are you depressed? Are you a bit low? Are you, you know, have you suffered a loss? Are you grieving? Are you looking for answers? And then
a sense of belonging.
And so your mind will be tilted in a certain way. And so, of course, you know, so you are making these micro choices as you go along. But yeah, in terms of cult, like I said, I don't use it because it's got a negative connotation, and it does conjure up, you know, a Jonestown Waco situation. So that's why I don't use it. And it's we do use the term cult in like ancient history, because you look at like the ancient Greeks, especially, and they had cultic practices, for the gods, which meant that it was very specific. This does not mean a doomsday suicide or homicide. These were just very regulated practices to be done, to the deity, for the deities, and to gain the deity's grace on oneself. And some of these groups were secret. So that's more of the term of cult in an ancient history sense. But in the modern sense, it's not wise to use it.
Well, that's good to know.
And maybe I'll reach out in a year or two and see where you're at and what more
Please do.
accomplishment you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, we've had a pretty deep talk today, but I mean, there's always, as I said to you, there's so many layers of my story that it's very, if you reach out in 2 years, like there's probably more things that I've understood better, deeper, and I want people women especially, to be able to follow my story and be able to go, she started with this and then it went to that and then that and then that and then that, like to help them rather than just like, she did this thing and then that's it.
Yeah, like you didn't have the resources, you didn't have like support. It was all internally, this dialogue pulling you to change. And that is truly like remarkable. But I feel like that dialogue, that spark is in all of us, but not everybody follows through with it.
No, they don't.
People push it down. It takes courage to just make that move and follow your intuition.
Oh yeah, it does. It really does. And I think that like people are too busy trying to fit in and they don't listen, like, I mean, I've sort of embraced my weirdness and it's just like, well, whatever. You can think I'm weird, or you can think I'm different or what have you. You go, you do that. But I'm going to do this and you're not going to force me into something.
Well, again, thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, that's okay. Yes, well, likewise. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shara. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
2 books Claire recommended. The first one, Leaving the Fold by Marlene Wynell, PhD. Second one, Degrees of Separation by Zalman Newfield. So after reviewing the podcast, there were several questions I wish I would have asked Claire, so I emailed her. The first question I asked was, what did Tony do for work? Her response was, Tony worked as a carpenter and he worked for a friend in Goulburn, a few hours drive away. The next question I asked is, what other controlling ways did the leaders of the community control the people? And she said, in addition to the people asking permission to go to the grocery store and being told the phones were tapped, other ways we were controlled were being forced to join the religious order and adhere to the vows, attending prayers 3 times daily, eating together as a group 2 times daily, wearing modest clothing, constantly being reminded that God and Our Lady are watching you, and knowing that members of the inner circle were watching and reporting back to the leader. So I did ask her a couple other questions, but I want to go more in depth with her answer next time we meet. So we're planning on meeting hopefully in the next 6 months to a year. So if you thought of any questions you wish I would have asked, please put them in the comment section and I'll do my best at getting responses to those. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast and thank you for watching. If you or somebody you know would like to be interviewed, please find me on Facebook at My Journey So Far.
Bless my mind, I fell in love with all the heart. I made my world a part of my journey. You can't take it from me. My life, I'm in the driver's seat. Nobody can take my spot. Keep pushing, don't ever quit. Been dreaming right from the start.